we'll just proceed. That'll be fine. Thank you all for coming today. We appreciate being able to see what all our gifts to all that takes place with these kids in the summertime contribute. I think that, I don't know about you, but I didn't realize that we were doing as much as we were doing, so that's great. We're glad that we have people back that have been away, and we hope that's an indication that you're feeling better. Kathy, we're glad you're here, and we hope your dad's doing better. Tell him we've saved him a place right up here. So, you know, we'll probably have a chance to say it a few more times, but I think we ought to get started saying, or the time will run out on us. Carolyn, we appreciate the place you've had in our class across these years. We're going to miss you and Doug, and you all have done a wonderful job representing our church and giving us a period of stability and strength that was very, very important. So we appreciate you being a part of this class. What are you going to do, Nick? Get rid of all your thousands of Tennessee books?
One at a time.
One at a time. We appreciate you bringing this concern about this child at Tyner. That's so sad. Okay, let's see what we can do with this lesson in a short time. It's time for some of y'all already to leave, so I hope that you know about, in our town, a place called Songbirds. If you've never been there, then you might ought to put that on your bucket list. It's down in that new area of town on the back side of the terminal building at the Chattanooga Choo Choo. And there's a collection of guitars in there that is supposedly worth about $10 million. And even if you don't know much about guitars, which I don't, it really is interesting to see what they put down there. It may be one of the most substantial collection of guitars in the United States. So that'll give you something to do this week. I showed up at Songbirds a couple of weeks ago, and I ran into 2 or 3 people that knew me. Although at first they didn't recognize me because of the context. And these people looked at me with just total kind of mystery in their eyes, saying, "What are you doing at Songbirds?" And you think, have I created such a stereotype about myself that nobody would expect you to show up in that environment? And then what became really strange to those people was when I explained I wouldn't miss seeing Steve Earle if I had the opportunity for anything. So I was down there to see Steve Earle. And if you don't know who Steve Earle is, then that'll give you something else to put on your bucket list. He's a Texas singer, and I've known about him for 25 years. So we're standing there, my son and me, in a line for a meet and greet, which my son made special for me. And this guy who's a lawyer, a colleague of my son's in town, walked up and started talking to me. And he said to me, which would be appropriate for the context, "Are you a guitar player?" And I heard my son half whisper behind me, "This ought to be good." And then I explained to this man, trying to be honest. I said, "I have a guitar and I know how to play it. But I'm not sure that the combination of those two facts makes you a guitar player in the way you're probably thinking about it." I said, "That's roughly equivalent to me saying that I have a set of golf clubs and I know how to use them, but I'm not sure that that makes me a golfer." Some of you can identify with that last statement. But that's not why I'm not a guitar player. I've decided that the reason I'm not a guitar player is that I don't have the clothes for that. If you saw Steve Earle, who I went to see, this very pleasant man, his persona is that of someone who looks like a wild motorcycle gang leader with a beard that comes down to about here. I don't have any clothes like Steve Earle. I also am unwilling to wear clothes like Porter Wagner. Remember that? It's turquoise and sequins, and so my clothes are keeping me from being a guitar player. When I play my guitar in front of my family, They informed me that I looked like the former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee. And I immediately race and put my guitar behind a chair and hide it. But this guy, Steve Earle, has one of the most beautiful spiritual songs that you could ever hear. And once you hear the refrain to that song, you just find yourself singing it for weeks and weeks. Do you know that song with the refrain? By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and there we wept as we remembered Zion. Now I've just proved that I know about songs, but I'm not a singer. But that is a beautiful, beautiful song. And when this rough cut looking man with a really spotted history sings it, then it really gives you a spiritual feeling all over. But then the song asks a question. And the question is, sitting by the rivers of Babylon, in this world in which you're remembering Zion and weeping, is it possible to sing the songs of the Lord in a strange land? And that question just eats on me. Is it possible to find happiness and joy in the midst of a world sometimes that can go very, very strange and very, very different from what we would expect? When we look and see the things that we see around us in our world, our strange land, on such a regular basis and in such ways that dominate our minds, is it possible to find joy and happiness to sing the songs of the Lord? All of what this song says is highly accurate biblically. When it talks about the rivers of Babylon, and you'll find it in the 137th Psalm, it's talking about the Tigris and Euphrates. When it talks about the rivers of Babylon, it talks about Jewish people that have been taken to Babylonian exile and are in total slavery and in total bondage. If you dig a little deeper, you find out that the people that were really carried off to Babylonian exile were the cream of the crop of Israel, were the very best of the best. And among this group were likely people that were responsible for a lot of the psalms, both creating them and singing them. Among this group were the temple singers, which in Israel in that day and time would have been roughly equivalent to the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And so certainly these Babylonians, if for no other reason than to want to be entertained, wanted to hear these wonderful Jewish singers sing. And so it was accurate that here were these wonderful singers with songs of God in their heart, but how could they sing these songs in a strange land? That section of Scripture is also very psychologically accurate. I'll recall when I had my counseling practice here at Centenary that I had a call one day from a guy that I'd been in graduate school with in Knoxville. And he was calling me about his father. And he said, my father is acting in a very strange way. And I'm afraid that there's something wrong with him. And I didn't know where to turn for help and thought you could help me. And I said, well, what's going on with your father? He says, he's in a Methodist church choir in Birmingham. He's the leader of one of the sections of that choir, and it's a wonderful choir. He's been in that choir most all of his adult life. And last week, he quit the choir. He wasn't mad at the choir director, and he wasn't having any problems with other choir members, but he quit the choir. And I'm not a genius, but the first words that came back in response is, your father's depressed. Because if you study depression and you know that you've got someone for whom singing has been an important part of their lives, even if it's in the shower or in the car or at the karaoke bars where I'm sure you hang out. If singing has been an important part of a person's life and they suddenly stop, then you know that somehow they have become significantly depressed. And so the guy responded, well, he's not really showing depression. I said, he's depressed. And they got this guy involved with a psychologist in Birmingham, and they got him on some antidepressant medications. It wasn't long till he was back in the choir singing, and the happiness and joy of his life was somehow restored. And so, if we find ourselves in situations and we can't sing, if we find ourselves in situations in which there is such a strangeness about our land or the world that we personally inhabit, and we can't sing the songs of the Lord, then that signals that we are in a kind of trouble that can be very threatening. I'm going to shift, or it's going to look like I am. I wonder if anybody in here knows much about the religion that's out there in the world called Rastafarian. The Rastafarians have been around for some time, and they became especially prominent in Jamaica in the 1960s, and that's kind of the pulsing heartbeat of their religion in Jamaica. The Rastafarians, like a lot of modern people, in terms of new religions, have created a religion that there are probably aspects of it that you just would not identify with at all. You'd probably feel very uncomfortable with it. The Rastafarians believe that the center of the world is Ethiopia, and that's where God created the world to start with and where the first human beings came from. That may not be historically that far off base. The Rastafarians believe that our white Jesus, and as shows up in so much of our Christian art, is absolutely wrong, that Jesus was black. And so if you see pictures of Jesus that are black, or kind of artistic icons of Jesus that are black, that's probably Rastafarian. Probably neither of those is correct. Jesus was probably the olive-colored skin of most original inhabitants of Israel, but that's what they believe. And the Rastafarians even have this weird belief that Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, was kind of a second coming of God. Haile Selassie even rejected that. So there are elements of Rastafarianism that really would seem odd to us. But like with a lot of religions, there are elements that we would feel totally comfortable with. Rastafarians believe that the service of God to other people is the most important thing you can do. The Rastafarians believe that if you do things to help people that are oppressed and people that don't have very much, that is what God intends for you to do. And so if there had been Rastafarians in here today, although they would have looked a bit out of place with their dress and dark color perhaps, they would have admired everything that we've said about the summer programs of the church and Camp Lookout. They would have thought that that is exactly what legitimate followers of God do. And so while there are many elements of their faith that we would not believe in very much probably, there are other elements in which we would find great commonality. And so if you go to Jamaica, then you're apt to run into a lot of Rastafarians. But here's what's unique about these people. These people who have used their religion to fight for social justice, and these people who have used their religion to help people in need, these people have come from some of the most oppressed ghetto levels of life in Jamaica that you could ever imagine. And in the 1960s, when they decided that they were going to use their faith to try to come out from under oppression, they also created one of the most important musical forms of the modern age, reggae. And I know that you all probably don't have a lot of reggae records that you are listening to, but you probably know what that is, especially if you've been to Jamaica and the Caribbean. Reggae is a joyous music. It is a happy music. It is a music that when you hear it, you just can't hardly keep still when it's around. It's a music that just infuses life with joy and with pleasure. And so if you don't have Bob Marley on your listening list, you can put him right up there next to Steve Earle. It's interesting kind of music that almost makes you smile when you hear it. But here's what the Rastafarians believed. The Rastafarians believed that even if you live in a strange land, even if you live in an oppressive world, even if you live in a world that you don't understand, if you can sing, that singing can be an expression of your holding on to joy in your life and maybe even resisting the oppression that is there. A touchstone of the whole Rastafarian faith is this 137th Psalm, where they identify Babylon with the forces of evil and oppression in the world, and they understand how hard it is to sing in a strange land. Now I'm going to say something odd, Al. It may be that reggae music for these people living in oppression in Jamaica is absolutely biblical. Because these same people that participate in the 137th Psalm also participate in the 40th Psalm. And just to remind you, the 40th Psalm reads powerfully, I waited patiently on the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the desolate pit, out of the miry bog, and he set my feet upon a rock, making my way secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. The Bible is trying to tell us that if we find ourselves in desolate pits, if we find ourselves in miry bogs, if we find ourselves needing to secure our lives on the rock of God, that we can pray to God that He will put a new song in our lives. Now, I'm not sure that means Steve Earle or reggae. I think it means symbolically that if we find ourselves in a strange land, and we find that strange land becoming depressing to us and overwhelming to us, that we could pray to God that He would help us find some kind of new music, some kind of new joy, some kind of new way in our lives that will help us hold on in the midst of things that become very strange. I think we live in a strange land. I find it strange that in this aging process, that capacities that were easily manifested 20 years ago or 30 years ago don't come as easily anymore. That's strange. I find it's a strange land because increasingly we look around and people that have been very, very important to us and that have been part of our actual identities are no longer maybe there. I find it a strange land that sometimes the course of life goes in unexpected ways that we would never have imagined. Or I find it a strange land that we can have events happening around us that make no sense in any way at all, and we don't seem to be able to figure out how to get beyond those events. We live in a strange land, and sometimes it can become oppressive and overwhelming. And sometimes God needs to help us to put new music in our mouths that will allow us to still have praise and still have joy and still have something of a thrill and newness about life that allows us to stand above the strangeness that threatens us. Now, up until yesterday, that was the end of my Sunday school lesson. But it was searching for a conclusion, and it found it yesterday. And so I got up at 4:30 and watched the wedding. How about you? Because I thought that's going to be pretty beautiful, and it was. And you hope for that young man who's had so much tragedy in his life, and that young woman whose life has not been easy, that they've found the kind of happiness it looks like they were kind of exuding. I loved seeing St. George's Chapel. Some of you have seen it in person. I bet Charles has. It looks a lot like our church, doesn't it? That beautiful stained glass at the back. So it was a beautiful wedding ceremony. And I love the structure and the class of all that high Anglican kind of music and ceremony that they had. All the time realizing that their congregations are like ours, they're getting smaller all the time. That their churches are trying, sometimes like a lot of ours, to figure out how to hang on and how to be relevant. And in the midst of all of that beautiful music, a black choir from South London sang what for our age was almost a rock song, Stand By Me. A song that was covered by everybody from Ernest Tubb to John Lennon. That's a wide range. But when that black choir sang that song, it became spiritual. And you realize there's a new song in the Anglican church. And you realize that some of the people there felt like that was a strange land. I wonder what that old queen thought about that. But I also thought, that's a new song. And that new song gives the promise of new life. And that song gives the promise of the kind of joy that even those staid and stodgy old Anglicans seem to have faces while those choir members sang. We live in a strange land. We live in a strange world. Not a week passes that strangeness doesn't creep up on us in some way. We need to pray that God would put some new music in our lives. That God would put a new song in our mouths so that we can find ourselves securely stepping on the rock of His salvation and His way. May God help us as we sit down in the midst of our strange land and maybe sometimes are moved to weeping for the way things once were, perhaps, that God can give us a new music that will lift us and give us joy and give us a sense of praise for what is good in our lives. Let us pray. Help us, O God, when we feel encompassed about by strangeness, by things that are unexpected and unexplainable. Help us, O God, that we might not get depressed, and help us that we might not just simply sit down and weep for what once was or might be. But, O God, help us that we might find a new song in our mouths, and that we might find in praise and joy and gratitude for what we have a way to secure our steps in the midst of your strength and to secure our steps in the midst of your love. God, help us in a strange land to find ways of acquiring new songs in our hearts. For we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for coming today. Charles, does that about get us there?
I think so.
All right, we can run to church now.